The Harvard lecture hall fell silent as Professor Malcolm Reed adjusted his designer glasses, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows, casting his shadow dramatically across the polished wooden stage. The renowned political scientist was known for his scathing critiques of conservative policies, and tonight's sold-out event promised to be no exception. Today we examine the fundamental flaws in traditional American values, Reed announced, his voice carrying a hint of condescension that had become his trademark. And who better represents these outdated ideologies than our guest? The audience of graduate students and faculty members shifted forward in their seats, hanging on Reed's every word. The tension in the room was palpable, like electricity before a storm. Vice President JD Vance has agreed to this academic discussion, despite knowing he's entering what some might call the lion's den. Reed smirked, drawing knowing laughter from the crowd. Perhaps bravery, or perhaps foolishness. From the moment JD Vance walked onto the stage, the contrast between the two men was striking. While Reed paced with theatrical flourishes in his tailored suit, Vance moved with quiet confidence, dressed simply but professionally. His calm demeanor seemed to unsettle Reed, who had clearly expected nervousness. If you're enjoying this showdown of ideas and want to see more content that exposes the truth behind political narratives, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. We bring you stories the mainstream media won't touch. Mr. Vice President, Reed began, deliberately omitting the appropriate title, your rise from what you called hillbilly roots to political power makes for a compelling narrative. But surely you realize your story is the exception, not the rule. Your policies actually hurt the very communities you claim to represent. The audience murmured in agreement, many nodding vigorously. This was exactly what they had come to see. The liberal champion dismantling conservative ideology piece by piece. Vance's expression remained neutral as he leaned slightly toward his microphone. First, Professor Reed, I appreciate the invitation to your campus. Open dialogue is essential to democracy. Reed waved his hand dismissively. Let's not waste time on pleasantries. Your administration's economic policies have been called regressive by every reputable economist at this university. Every economist? Vance raised an eyebrow. That's interesting, considering I'm holding a peer-reviewed paper by Professor Jameson from your own economics department that supports our approach. He held up a document that Reed clearly hadn't expected. The professor's confident smile faltered momentarily. James Jameson is hardly representative of academic consensus. The same James Jameson you cited extensively in your last book, Vance countered, his voice still measured but pointed. A few surprised laughs escaped from the audience. Reed's fingers tightened around his podium. This wasn't following his planned trajectory. Let's move to your stance on educational reform, which many describe as an attack on academic freedom. By many. Do you mean the 4 professors who co-authored your recent position paper? Vance asked, pulling another document from his folder. The same paper funded by the Progressive Policy Institute, where your wife serves as director? A flush crept up Reed's neck. My wife's professional affiliations are irrelevant to this discussion. About as relevant as my Appalachian roots were to your opening statement, Vance replied with a small smile. The atmosphere in the lecture hall shifted subtly. Students who had come expecting an academic execution were witnessing something entirely different. Reed sensed it too, his practiced confidence giving way to something harder, more defensive. Your administration's climate policies are scientifically indefensible, Reed pressed, his voice rising slightly. You've consistently opposed environmental protections that the scientific community universally supports. Universally? Vance tilted his head thoughtfully. Professor, would you consider NASA scientists part of that community? Reed rolled his eyes theatrically. Obviously. Then perhaps you could explain why NASA's chief environmental scientist endorsed our balanced approach last month. Vance slid a news article across the table separating them. Or why carbon emissions have decreased 12% under policies you're currently criticizing. The professor didn't reach for the article. His knuckles whitened against the podium. These are cherry-picked examples, Reed snapped, abandoning his earlier professional tone. Your policies cater to religious conservatives while ignoring settled science. Actually, Vance replied, I'd like to discuss how you define settled science, particularly regarding the study you referenced earlier. Reed's expression changed just for a moment, but the flash of concern was unmistakable. Which study? He asked carefully. The Jensen Wyatt paper on climate intervention that your department promoted extensively, Vance said. The one where you publicly stated the data was ironclad and beyond question. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably. Several faculty members exchanged glances. That study underwent rigorous peer review, Reed finally replied, his voice slightly hoarse. It did, Vance agreed, until 3 of the peer reviewers withdrew their endorsements last week after discovering methodological flaws. I assumed you'd heard. The audience stirred. This clearly wasn't public knowledge yet. Reed's composure cracked further. Those allegations are premature and politically motivated. Perhaps, Vance acknowledged. But isn't it interesting that your department continues citing the study and policy recommendations despite the controversy? Particularly given that your Emerald Foundation received $2.3 million in grants based on its findings? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Reed's confident academic persona had vanished entirely, replaced by barely contained anger. You came prepared to attack me personally rather than debate ideas, Reed accused, his voice rising. This is exactly the kind of right-wing ambush tactics that undermines academic discourse. Vance remained calm. I came prepared to discuss facts, Professor Reed. Isn't that what this forum was supposed to be about? Facts rather than personalities? A student in the front row stifled a laugh, triggering a ripple of uncomfortable murmurs throughout the audience. Reed's carefully orchestrated takedown was unraveling, and everyone could sense it. Let's discuss your foundation's research then, Reed countered, attempting to regain control. Your Heritage America Institute has been criticized for methodological flaws in its economic research. By the Academic Integrity Board? Vance asked. Precisely, Reed pounced, thinking he'd found an opening. The same board that cleared our methodology last quarter, while flagging 17 studies from your department for citation manipulation? Vance asked, his tone still conversational rather than confrontational. Reed's face flushed deeper. Those reviews were procedurally flawed and currently under appeal. Of course they are, Vance nodded sympathetically. Just like the 7 previous reviews that reached similar conclusions. Something in Reed snapped. This is absurd. You come into my lecture hall with your working-class hero act, pretending you care about academic integrity when your entire administration is built on pandering to uneducated voters who don't know what's good for them. The words hung in the air like smoke. Several students looked uncomfortable, while others appeared shocked by the outburst. Reed seemed to realize immediately he had crossed a line, but it was too late. Vance waited a moment before responding, letting the professor's words fully resonate with the audience. And there it is, he said quietly. There what is? Reed demanded, though his voice had lost its authoritative edge. The worldview that's been driving this entire conversation, Vance replied. The belief that certain Americans, the ones you consider uneducated, need to be guided by their intellectual betters, that their values and concerns are somehow less valid because they don't have the credentials you respect. Reed started to interrupt, but Vance continued, his calm voice somehow commanding more attention than Reed's previous theatrics. You see, Professor, this isn't about climate policy or economic theory. It's about a fundamental disconnect in how we view America. You believe some voices matter more than others. I believe every American deserves equal respect, regardless of their education or background. The lecture hall had gone completely still. Even Reed's most devoted supporters seemed captivated by the vice president's words. When you dismiss millions of Americans as uneducated voters who don't know what's good for them, you're not defending democracy, you're undermining its very foundation, Vance continued. The factory worker in Ohio, the farmer in Iowa, the nurse in rural Kentucky, their experiences and concerns aren't less valid than yours. They're just different. Reed attempted to regain his footing. This populist rhetoric doesn't address the actual policy failures of your administration. Let's talk policy then, Vance agreed readily. Our administration introduced the Rural Development Initiative that's bringing high-speed internet to communities your policies ignored for decades. We've reopened manufacturing plants in towns academics like yourself had written off as inevitable casualties of progress. We've reduced prescription drug prices for seniors by 34%, while your proposed plan would have cut it by only 12%. Reed shook his head dismissively. Cherry-pick statistics that don't reflect the broader economic picture? Then let's look at the broader picture, Vance suggested, pressing a button on his remote that activated the lecture hall's main screen. A series of economic graphs appeared, sourced from Reed's own department. These are your university's economic indicators, Professor. Unemployment down, wages up, small business creation at a 15-year high. But more importantly, he clicked to the next slide, economic mobility in previously stagnant regions has increased dramatically. Reed stared at the familiar data, now being used to undermine his entire argument. Those improvements have other explanations, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Like what? Vance asked genuinely. Reed fumbled for words. Global market fluctuations, technological innovations, delayed effects from previous policies? Interesting theories, Vance nodded. And you've published research supporting these alternative explanations? The professor's silence was answer enough. A young woman in the third row raised her hand tentatively. Reed, desperate to shift attention away from himself, quickly acknowledged her. Professor Reed, she began, I've taken 3 of your courses and written my thesis on your economic theories. But, she glanced at Vance, then back to Reed. The data on the screen matches what we're seeing in my hometown. The manufacturing plant reopened. My dad got his job back. My brother's starting a business instead of leaving. How do you explain that? Reed's expression hardened. Individual anecdotes aren't statistically significant in macroeconomic analysis. Her family's livelihood isn't an anecdote, Professor, Vance interjected gently. It's their life. And when thousands of similar anecdotes appear across the country, at some point they become data. Another student stood without being called on. I interned at the Progressive Policy Institute last summer, he announced. We were specifically instructed not to include certain positive economic indicators in our reports if they contradicted the narrative. He looked directly at Reed. I was told you approved that policy. Reed's face went from red to white. That's a completely baseless accusation. Is it? A voice called from the back of the hall. All heads turned to see an older man standing near the exit. Because I have the emails, Malcolm, including the ones where you discussed bearing data that didn't fit your predetermined conclusions. Murmurs rippled through the audience as the man walked down the center aisle. James, Reed's voice was barely audible. This isn't the appropriate forum. It seems like exactly the right forum, Professor James Jameson replied. You've been speaking about academic integrity. Let's discuss it. He turned to address the stunned audience. For 3 years, I've watched as research has been manipulated, data cherry-picked, and conclusions predetermined in service of a narrative rather than truth. Reed was visibly sweating now. These are serious allegations that should be addressed through proper channels. We tried proper channels, Jameson replied. You blocked the ethics review. You threatened funding cuts to departments that questioned your methods. You leveraged your relationship with the dean to silence dissent. The atmosphere had transformed completely. What began as Reed's triumphant takedown of conservative ideology had become a very public exposure of academic misconduct. This is absurd, Reed attempted one last time, looking desperately around the room for allies. Vice President Vance obviously orchestrated this ambush to distract from his administration's failures. Vance shook his head. I had no idea Professor Jameson would be here today. Though I'm not surprised others have noticed the same patterns I did when reviewing your work. Jameson approached the stage, holding up a flash drive. Everything is here. The altered data sets, the manipulated peer reviews, the threats to colleagues who question results. He turned to the audience. As academics, our only loyalty should be to truth, not to ideology, not to personal advancement, and certainly not to political narratives. Reed's shoulders slumped in defeat as he realized the extent of his exposure. Years of carefully constructed academic authority were crumbling before his eyes. A young man filming in the back called out, Professor Reed, will you be resigning from your position given these allegations? The question hung in the air as students began recording with their phones. the moment rapidly spinning beyond Reed's control. Vance watched the scene unfold with no satisfaction in his expression, only a certain sadness at witnessing a respected institution's integrity compromised. Finally, he stepped forward. Perhaps we should end the formal portion of today's event. Professor Reed deserves the opportunity to address these concerns through appropriate university processes. It was a lifeline, small, but more than Reed deserved. The professor nodded stiffly and gathered his papers with trembling hands before making a quick exit through the side door. As the audience erupted in excited conversation, Vance approached the student who had spoken about her hometown. "Thank you for sharing your story," he said quietly. "It's voices like yours that need to be heard more in these discussions." She looked up at him with newfound respect. "I always thought people like me didn't matter in the big picture." "The big picture is made up of people like you," Vance replied. "Never let anyone tell you your experience doesn't count." As Vance prepared to leave, Professor Jameson approached him. "I'm no conservative, Mr. Vice President," he said frankly. "We probably disagree on many policy issues." "I would expect nothing less," Vance smiled. "But integrity isn't partisan," Jameson continued. "Neither is respect for the American people, all of them. I wish more of my colleagues remembered that." The two men shook hands as students gathered around, eager to engage with both the conservative vice president and the liberal professor, who had just upended the academic hierarchy. Outside, Reed sat alone on a bench, his career in tatters. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Academic scandal erupts at Harvard. Progressive icon accused of data manipulation. Inside, the conversation continued without him. More balanced, more honest, and more representative of America than anything that had occurred in that lecture hall for years. Because at the end of the day, truth doesn't care about credentials or titles. It simply is. And sometimes it takes a man who remembers his humble roots to remind the ivory tower that real wisdom doesn't come from academic papers alone. It comes from respecting the dignity and intelligence of every American, regardless of where they come from or how many degrees they hold. If you appreciated this look at how academic bias influences our national conversation, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We're committed to bringing you the stories that matter, the perspectives that are often silenced, and the truth that transcends partisan divisions. God bless you, and God bless America.